Long day.
Long day, but we're gonna have a good time.
Yeah. All right. Well, why don't we get started? We have about an hour. We're just going to spend
Okay.
together. Um,
Okay.
so welcome everyone, and welcome Morgan Jerkins to this event to celebrate the release of your latest book, CAUL BABY.
Mhm.
Um, we're going to spend, as I say, about an hour. Morgan's going to do some reading. But first, let me offer an introduction to Morgan, who is an introduction to myself, and then also Morgan. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Korb. I'm the director of the MFA in Writing program at Pacific University. And Morgan Jerkins is a member of our nonfiction faculty teaching this semester, and we are very happy that you can be here. Morgan is a New York Times bestselling author of This Will Be My Undoing, which is featured here. Living at the intersection of Black, female, and feminist in white America, which was longlisted for the Penn Diamondstein Spiegelvogel Award for the art of the essay and the Barnes & Noble Discover Pick. And also Wandering in Strange Lands, which I do not have featured on my bookshelf here today. A Daughter of the Great Migration reclaims her roots. And her third book, as I say, CAUL BABY, a novel, is what we're here to celebrate, and which was released earlier this month in April. Recently, Morgan left a senior editorship at Zora magazine, where if you haven't followed her work there, you can go and dig up all the archives. And she's taken up as ESPN's The Undefeated senior editor for culture. Morgan is leading a team there focused on long and short-term features on African-American music, theater, film, and fashion, as well as some other forms of entertainment. And I want to say congratulations,
Thank you.
Morgan, on that new position. Do you want to start just by saying a thing or two about that new position and how it's going?
Yeah, the position is going really well. It's funny because a lot of people ask me like, "Oh, what do you know about sports?" And I'm like, "Not as much as you think." So I'm working on just all the other intersections of culture, and it's been really good. It's been
Terrific.
good. Hmm.
Great, great. So before you do some reading from the book, which I'd like for
Hmm.
you to start with,
Okay.
can you talk with us a little about the story that you've composed in CAUL BABY without ruining anything, say, and give
Oh
us a
yes.
sense of the who and the where and the what to
Okay.
ground the conversation for us?
Right. Okay. So I'll start off by saying that I'm working out of a folkloric tradition with Call Baby. So um a call is basically when a child is born inside of the amniotic sac. And if you get queasy, do not Google image it. But if any of you have seen a birth before, I think you would know what I'm talking about. But in African American tradition, it's believed that if you're born with a call or if you're born with a veil, as some Black people say, you have a gift. The gift to protect and heal, sometimes the gift of second sight, which means that you can either see in the past, you can see in the future, or both. And so basically what I did with this book is that I wanted to think about protection and healing, and I thought a lot about Black women. Black women has always been at the center of my professional writing career, particularly with This Will Be My Doing, which is how my book writing career started. And I thought about it, and I was thinking about all these ideas about gentrification, for example, because the story is based in Harlem, thinking about capitalism, and the legacy of Black women's bodies being used in this country and obviously around the world. And what I did was I created this call bearing family, if you will, of women who sell pieces of their call to the highest bidder, and how this type of enterprise puts them at odds with their rapidly transforming community in a gentrifying Harlem, because they're most of their patrons are wealthy white people. So it definitely puts them at odds with that. And what's going on in this book is it takes place right in the center of conflict, where they take in an abandoned child who has a call bearing, who's a call bearer herself. What they don't realize is that that child's biological mother has a vendetta against them because of the way that they have sort of har- neglected the family in the past. So this story shows the trajectory of these two families, and how they weave in and out of each other's lives.
Right, right. That that's a wonderful setup. And Morgan, would you mind just spending some time reading from the book so we have you can hear what it sounds like in our head?
Absolutely. So
Take it
I'm
away.
going to read from the sixth chapter, and I'm going to read about Mama. Mama is the matriarch of the Melanson, the family, the Carbearing family. And I want to just write about well, I want to read this part where I'm talking about the brownstone in which they all live, and they're desperate to maintain their foothold in this brownstone in Harlem because, as I mentioned earlier, it's rapidly gentrifying. So everyone's being displaced. There were cracks on all four corners of Mama's bedroom, and they were hungry. Black, jagged, and deep, they resembled outstretched hands whose claws leaned toward the center, anticipating when they could devour her whole. They were Mama's biggest nuisance. Over the years, she'd squandered thousands to get them painted over, but there was no polymer in the world that could overpower a vengeful spirit. She knew their brownstone was askew ever since Iris, her daughter, had been born. Cups stained in the cupboard minutes after they had been washed, subtle sounds like fingernails scraping against windows or sharp winds on the inside persisted. But ever since Iris's premonition about that woman, Layla, the outside presences became more apparent. The holes in the ceiling grew larger, the wallpaper chipped and crusted no matter how many times it was patched over, and the aroma in certain rooms was stale and dead, even if perfumed oil in glass decanters was used to diffuse the smell. She didn't want to believe it. The house had been lived in for decades. Wear and tear was natural, but Mama was getting older. She had to move from her master bedroom down to the office on the first floor because her legs were no match for the stairs in her old age. Though the call nevertheless protected her body, it did not protect the mind in the same way. She had always been perceptive, paranoid even, which is why she took Iris's words to heart. But now she wondered if taking heed to that premonition about Layla's unborn child wasn't enough. The Melanson family were accustomed to precarious living situations. Before migrating, they lived along the Cane River in Natchitoches, Louisiana. Each family owned a home on heirs' property from the river to the back swamp. The ranch in which Mama resided was on land between the river and an artificial levee, the living room itself right along the central waterway, a risk for whenever there were high tides and hurricanes. Cochon de lait characterized many weekends, night-long carrying on and feasting on roast suckling pig, before Sunday Mass at St. Augustine. When pallbearers lived peacefully, they distilled oil from their camphor trees and sold them as medicine and perfume as a side hustle to everyone from the neighbors to the priests. Ever since Hollow was born, Mama had been reminiscing about simpler days spent raising chickens and hogs or watching the sun touch the valley's horizon through the sand hills. She felt secure. Her family was secure, their legacy intact. Hollow regenerated CAUL more quickly than anyone Mama had ever seen. She was the future, the successor. For the first years of Hollow's life, Mama fantasized without worry. She would sink deep into her mattress and recall the smell of the sycamore or azalea. How, as a child, unlike her relatives, she was endowed with an apprehension about her sense of place while living on a seemingly congenial pocket of space where the land and water met. Moving to Harlem had brought its challenges. The camellia red beans, white lily flour, Creole seasoning, and Louisiana hot sauce did not cook so richly here. In the summertime, the scent of fried chicken wafted through the air. Then in the colder months, the air smelled of nothing but rain. They substituted their gardens for flower pots, lawns for stoops, camphor oil for their bodies. But at least they owned their brownstone outright. She and her husband, Alexander, had pooled their resources together, what she made selling her call and what he made as a blacksmith, to move up north and start anew. Of course, the city lights had been too much temptation for him. Just like a man, Mama often told herself when she caught herself missing him. He had no interest in being a blacksmith anymore or hearing about how Mama was progressing with the call bearing business. Whatever earnings they cultivated, he squandered on drinking and gambling until finally Mama caught him laid up with a cabaret singer. She kicked him and his belongings out on Frederick Douglass Boulevard, and he left without so much as a request for reconciliation, let alone an apology. The only thing she could remember him by was a small wrinkled photo of him that she kept on her desk and had never thought to remove after all these years. Since Alexander left her with two small children, Mama poured everything she could back into their home, devoting painstaking effort to making sure every corner was dusted and every surface polished. The home, like her business and her children, was her world, and she was hell bent on preserving her world bounded within these four walls. A crack here or there wasn't going to change that. At least that was what she told herself. But the cracks alongside the creaking floorboards and the shoddy lighting made her feel like a visitor in her own home for years. Mama stared at the cracks and wondered if or when they would part the house in half. Her fear was now mitigated by the fact that Hollow was here. She was growing wonderfully year after year. A successor was now in place. Mama could pass on if she wanted. She was already in her late 70s and she had seen and heard enough. But she still didn't feel as confident as she wanted to with Josephine, her daughter. Mama should have known from birth that Josephine would never leave her side, sometimes to a fault. In the womb, Josephine relentlessly kicked Mama in the ribs whenever she ran errands, and if Mama could pull away from her, as if Mama could pull away from her. When Josephine was a toddler, after she had weaned, Mama would fall asleep often and find that Josephine had unbuttoned her blouse and was sucking from her breast. What startled Mama most was that Josephine did not cry or unlatch when she knew that she was being watched. She sucked more vigorously until Mama pulled her away, massaging her red-shaped nipple and then banishing Josephine to her room. Josephine never gave her any trouble besides not being able to produce a caul-bearing child. She was always eager to please, sycophantically and annoyingly so. But as Josephine got older, Mama noticed a strength inside of her too. Mama would never admit it to her daughter, but she was worried and damn near convinced that Josephine was going to walk out that front door years ago. When Hala was born and Josephine became her mother, there was a ferocity to her disposition that Mama had never seen before, and she liked it. In her innermost private thoughts, Mama wondered when and where Josephine would test her again. Mama ran her finger along her own bare skin. Most of her caul had already been carved and sold. Fantasies of what would it be like to rip these last few parts off and inevitably welcome death became more frequent and disruptive, appearing in and out of the back door of her mind during the most trivial of activities. She was just tired, in all essence of the word, but that still wouldn't relieve her of what to do with these cracks. When the sun came up in the morning, there was another thing to be fixed in the house. The damn moisture in the air spoiled the stone on the exterior. There were the costs to clean, patch, and replace the stone, stoop upkeep, repairing a ceiling leak after Helena forgot to stop a bathtub from overflowing. The cast iron work needed updating, another several $1,000s. The constant hemorrhaging of money concerned the repairman. They asked why Mama kept repairing the house when all the money going into it could be used for another home. With the rising property taxes, where else could she go in Harlem? She refused to be displaced to Inwood, much less Washington Heights. But Mama and the rotating repairman knew that it was only a matter of time before the house would cave in. The foundation was rotten, the cracks too wide, the roots too deep.
Morgan, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Wish we were in person so we could all see each other and applaud.
Thank you.
So I have a bunch of questions that I'd like to ask you about this. And as we get closer to sort of 6:15 in the Pacific and 9:15 in the East, I'll turn it to the audience for some Q&A from them. But the passage you read, I mean, we didn't talk about what kind of questions I was going to ask, and maybe the passage you read speaks to the questions that I have in mind, in part because that moment feels so like it feels like it contains so much of the novel all within that one passage.
Oh wow! Okay.
Can you just speak to the sort of the sort of way in which that passage sort of like shoots out in all these different directions?
Oh yeah, well
it reflects all the concerns of the book.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is, as I was reading, I was like, "Whoa, this does encapsulate a lot." So what I will say is that, man, where do I even start? I am so invested in familial dynamics, right? And I really wanted to center these women as much as possible, but I also wanted to understand the desperation of what they do to themselves and to each other. And the thing about Mama is, as I've read from the chapter, she's kind of dealing with trauma from displacement already. She's already been displaced from her community in Louisiana. Her husband has abandoned her. And because of that, she is desperate, paranoid, even as I wrote in that excerpt, to hold on to her family and the brownstone and the business. But the brownstone is literally falling apart, but she's adamant on staying there. One of the reasons why she's adamant on staying there is because Harlem is her home, and she understands that everyone else around her, their time is limited. But she also understands that, her family is maturing as well. She's not going to be at the head anymore. And what does that mean for her life? Because her life is so much built around this identity of what she can sell literally to other people. So I read that section because I wanted people to understand the interior lives of Black women, the stuff that they don't often say, and also just to make sure I complicate Mama, because she can definitely, I can see why some people might look at her as a villain because of what she subjects her children and her grandchildren to. But I also want them to understand the undercurrents as to why she acts this way, because she feels like because they all caul bearers, they're special. But this gift comes with a curse. And it's that isolation that I wanted you all to be able to sense as I read that passage.
And as you talk about, the phrase, the innermost private thoughts of these people, and you're talking about the significance of family dynamics to you in your work and in this work in particular, one thing that I kept noting as I was reading was that I would feel an affinity for this character over here because I got into her internal private thoughts. And then I was sort of pulled in the other direction, and I had this affinity for this other character who was at odds with the person we were just talking with,
Yeah,
right?
right,
And
right.
so that phrase of, like, you might think of Amat as a villain, had me thinking of the sort of old cliche that says every villain is a hero in her own story, right?
Oh wow, I never heard that.
And
Oh
so
wow,
if that's
I
if
love
that's
that. I love that.
true, then that was for me what was explaining the sort of movement back and forth in affinities I had for this character or that character, because
Mm-hmm.
as this person's having her innermost thoughts, I have to be drawn to that. And then as
Yeah,
this person's having her innermost thoughts about that person, I have to be drawn this way. So
right.
can you talk with me about, because that's also, I imagine, the process of, it could be a process of writing, that you
Mm,
write deeply into the innermost thoughts of this character, but then you have to flip it around and do the innermost thoughts of the character who's at odds with that person.
mm-hmm.
So as you were writing, what was the experience of sort of your own shifting affinities from one person to another? If you take my meaning.
There are a couple. I'm gonna try to do it from multiple threads. If you
Please,
bear
yeah.
with me. So one of the things that I'll say is that I don't know why I'm this way, but my friends have always said to me, Morgan, you give grace to so many people. Most of my friends, they have shorter fuses when it comes to people and their bad decision making. And my friends used to always say, you give grace to so many people, and in turn I give grace to them. So I used to always be seen as like the sage in my group, because people will always come to me for advice, because I would always want to pivot and be like, okay, well, consider this narrative. It doesn't mean it's right, but it does mean that multiple truths can exist at the same time. So that's one part of it, is that I try to give grace to other people, because my mother has always told me, you just don't know what people are going through. That's not to say that you should absolve them, but it's just saying to keep in mind that there's other things going on that could propel someone to act away with you that you don't like. The second school of thought that I'll say is, um I am inspired by this late artist. Her name is Kathleen Collins. She was a multi-hyphenate author, playwright, director, and she died in her mid 40s from cancer, and she's now getting a wonderful afterlife in the literary space. So whatever happened to interracial love, and also there's a book of collections of her plays and scripts and letters and all that you can purchase right now. Um, and she did a lecture at Howard University in the 80s. And what she said was, in America, right, even though we're a democracy, we're also a theocracy, because so much of what we think about the laws and what considered morality is based on Christianity. Well, when it comes to Black people in this country, we either could be the saint or the sinner, right? We oftentimes pit as the sinner, which is why people in this day and age justify our deaths all the time, or the sinner because this is what slave masters used to say we were, and that's why they had to colonize us. Or you have to be 100% good, because in the history of America, Black people couldn't just be normal. And so for me, that inspired me, because it's like, these women are normal. They have this gift, but they're normal because they're messy, because that's what life is. And so I am committed to the work of destroying that binary between the saint and the sinner for Black female characters. The third school of thought that I would say is, like, I'm inspired by villains. Like, I love Tony Soprano. I love Michael Corleone. And the reason why I like these two characters is because they've done some heinous things, and we've seen them do heinous things in The Sopranos and The Godfather, respectively. But if you look at what drove them to these points, an abusive mother, right? The death of the unforeseen death of a newlywed wife, right? Loss, grief, the burden of responsibility. Then you start to see them as human. You don't have to like them, but you start to see why they do the things they do. So for all of these three separate threads, it wasn't hard for me to make my mom the villain, but also understand her backstory, for me to make Josephine, you dislike the reason why she's so up under her mother, but understand why, because she's so desperate to please. And haven't we been so desperate to please at one point in our life? So it really wasn't her. I wanted the readers to be like, God, I can't stand this person, but I still empathize with them.
Did any of your characters surprise you as you were sort of digging into them and you found something you weren't expecting, say a Mama or Josephine or Iris, maybe?
Yeah, so I will say the character that surprised me the most, her name is Helena. And Helena was supposed to be the successor of the Mendelssohn family, but she suffered a really bad accident to where she cannot regenerate CAUL anymore. And I'm not going to spoil what the reasons for that and what all happened with the accident, but what surprised me about her character is I thought she was going to be more static. I thought that she was just going to be this traumatized, bitter person growing up as being the outlier. And what she realizes is that despite this accident, painting her for years, stretching from childhood to adulthood, she has a freedom that none of them will ever experience because she's not being monetized. Her body is not being commodified anymore. So once I started to realize that, and it's interesting because I used to be the kind of writer where I used to have like outlines for every chapter. It has to be this, and that happening. And I remember when I was doing my MFA at Bennington, there was a poet, I think her name is Mary Lowe, I think if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but she said about existing in the state of unknowing or not knowing, where you don't know where the story is going to lead. And you just keep writing. And when I started writing Helena as an adult and thinking about, where she's going, I was like, you know what? Like, she's actually free in a sense. And it was pretty fun writing her.
That's awesome. And then again, not to ruin anything, but her narrative takes over so much of the last third of the book, really. I mean, she becomes such a key figure in guiding these, and really in guiding the book to the end. I mean, she's in a really, really important central figure. And that sounds like there was a discovery in there that you saw that she could be that.
Yeah. So it was like when I started writing, I was like, you know what? Like, maybe she finds some type of healing or maybe some type of resolution moving forward. Okay, now I'm hurt in a way that these others are, but how am I moving forward with that?
Mm-hmm. So you just talked about your studying at Bennington, and I wanted to get to a moment in the acknowledgments of the book where you thank novelist, essayist Alexander Chee for, as you say, insisting that this initial short story be made into a novel. And then you joke something about like, does he ever, would this person ever steer me wrong? I think that's true. Can you talk with us a little about this germ of the novel that was the story and what work it involved to take something that's so, that, by nature is so compressed, and intricate, and really expanding it out in this way? And if you can think more too, as you're sort of answering that question, what role a mentor like Alexander Chee had in sort of guiding you towards something totally new?
Right. So the thing is, I'll say is, if any of you know Alexander Chee is, even minimally, he is one of the best literary citizens out there. So many people have been they have been mentored by him. They have gotten advice from him. All those sorts of things. And so when I found out that Alexander Chee was going to be at Bennington for my penultimate term, I knew I had to work with him. I was like, I'm dying to work with this person. And CAUL Baby originally started as a short story, and I don't write short stories. I've been writing full length fiction manuscripts, not only when I was in high school and college, but also when I was studying at Bennington. And I just wanted to experiment with the form. I was just like, you know what? Let me just experiment with the form. Let me just like see if I could do it. And I hated it because I remember I was the first one to be workshopped. I didn't have a choice. I was like, oh, and I was the youngest one in the class. So I was really nervous, but I saw how drawn in people immediately were to this world. And when we had our 101 to discuss my reading list, because I have to do creative annotations as well, he's like, I think this needs to be a novel. And he didn't tell me how to do it. He just gave me recommendations for books to read, and I just started expanding. It was already my usual mode. I just wanted to try short stories to be different. He's like, no, I think it should be a novel. And it's funny because when I was doing the promotion for this, he said on Twitter, he was like, I tell people to turn things into novels, but very few have taken me up on that advice like me.
Hmm.
And it's like, well, because if somebody like him says that, you might want to listen.
At Pacific, that's often the what's said about Ellen Bass, that if Ellen Bass gives you a piece of advice, you have to take it.
Yeah, it's just like, why not? You know what I mean? I was like, why not?
So I want to talk a little bit, or get you to think a little bit with us about something that you shared with us when you were in residency in January. And I think most of the people who are here with us tonight were either part of that or had an ability to see it. And when you were teaching with us in January, you spoke at length about recovering lost histories, the silences of the archives, you called it, and of writing what you called the marginalized self. And though the novel isn't the writing of a self exactly, I think what's clear in the narrative is the ongoing threats, really the ongoing threats against marginalized people, and the possibility of these ongoing silences within the archives. Like there's always that threat that these stories are going to be lost. And there's this amazing moment, which really popped out to me, where there's a key event in the novel, and I won't say what it is. There's a key event in the novel that gets described, as you say, worthy of documentation in the Studio Museum or in the Schomburg. And these are
yeah.
right?
I'm thinking of that too. Yep.
Two cultural landmarks in Harlem, the Schomburg being the New York Public Library Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. So I see I know one of the things I know about you is your interest in this preservation, and then that idea pops into this novel, right? So in thinking about these two themes that you brought to the community in the past, this idea of writing the marginalized South and thinking about recovery from silenced archives, to what extent are these themes sort of woven into this novel? And how?
Oh, that's a great question.
And in what ways are they as central to your fiction as they are to your nonfiction?
Right. So that's a really good question. So what I will say is that the silence of the archive kind of comes in subtly or maybe overtly in this book because it's based in Harlem. And if you know anything about Harlem for the past several years, actually longer than that, it is rapidly gentrifying. Case in point, me and my partner, we were going on an outing like last week, and we took an Uber literally 20 blocks up. And I stepped outside and I looked around a little bit disoriented, and I was like, wait a minute, I lived on that block. If we take her, I lived in that block, and actually that block is what inspired the Melon Song Brownstone. That's where I lived. And I didn't even recognize it. And so for me, this novel is my love letter to Harlem, but also it's a document for me to remember Harlem as I remember it, because 4 years ago, because I lived in that spot 4 or 5 years ago, and now it feels almost unrecognizable. And I realize how much Harlem is changing. And I think with the rising rent prices, the changing demographics of this historically and culturally rich place, what is going to be lost when we replace that bodega with another artisanal bagel shop? What's going to be lost? Like, for example, the Langston Hughes Brownstone is now not a museum. It's not an art center anymore. I think actually someone else bought it. Think about how much history is right then and there. Same thing with Maya Angelou's home right near Mount Morris Park. It's not a museum, but it's like, I think it's a private residence now. So what happens when, people pass on, when people move in and others move out and institutions change? And I think and especially with regards to Black history, it's already not as venerated as white American history. And so when we keep changing the landscapes of these very Black places, for lack of a better phrase, what happens to cultural memory? What happens to those documents?
Yeah. And you talk now about writing a love letter to Harlem that in some way captures the past 5 years. But then this book goes back 20 years.
Right, because when I realized, I said, okay, well, how long has gentrification been happening? And I read that gentrification really started hitting the turbo gear in the late 90s. I didn't know that. I thought it was like 2000. I thought it was probably like 2010 to 2011, but no, it was like right around the time where the story starts in 98. That's when stuff started to happen suddenly, but it was happening.
Yeah. And I've heard you talk with someone else in an interview kind of like a fun, exciting Instagram live that I saw recently,
Mm-hmm.
um, of Harlem being this character in the novel. So
Mm-hmm.
not only a place to document, but even a character in and of
Mm-hmm.
itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's most obvious to me, as you're talking about it now, and as I was reading the book, was that this character, like all of the characters, is undergoing this transformation, and part of that um, is, as you're describing, this sort of the rapid gentrification under the pressures, basically, of gentrification and whiteness. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
what's sort of pressing down on Harlem.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
there's a way in which Harlem, as a character, also, and maybe it's through the characters, but I just like for you to think with us a little bit
Mm-hmm.
through this, is that there's a kind of, because you're sort of writing within this folklore tradition,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, I there's a kind of inner life to Harlem in the same way that there's an inner life to these characters, and there's a kind of self-awareness in
Mm-hmm.
Harlem
Mm-hmm.
that I feel here, and it's in some ways probably the self-awareness that's contained in the narration.
Mm-hmm.
But in what ways did Harlem as a character and your characters' inner lives, like how did you think together about these two sort of characters, right? The character of the place and the characters of these individuals, and the sort of self-awareness that motivates them.
Well, yeah, well, I will say this, like, maybe it's because they're both mothers.
Yeah.
Harlem is a figurative mother. She has provided a home for people. She has given life, in a sense, for people, and a community, and her children, that being the community, want to protect her. She's also under attack. You know, she's very vulnerable. And I think that is what I think about. Maybe to me, like intuitively, Harlem is a Black mother, just like Mama and Josephine and, you know, Amara, they're Black mothers, and they're both very vulnerable to, you know, interlopers to the state. And I think that that is what I wanted to do. And I think another thing is like Harlem is just so, it's so palpably magical, if that makes sense. Like, you know, pre-pandemic, I mean, the sounds, albeit cacophonous, um, full of life, the smells, the textures, the type of people that coming out, the food, the you know, all of these things. It's like you cannot come to Harlem and not be inspired by this place. So I knew that I wanted to be very particular with Harlem by naming certain places and certain street names, because not only is because I want people to maybe perhaps do a literary tour someday by using my book, but also because of the fact that, like, when I moved to New York from South Jersey, a very modest suburban town. And what you know about suburbia is like appearance wise, it's pretty monotonous. Everybody has the green lawns, the houses have the same stones, it's very much the same. Sound is delineated, it's always in your home. You have fences, gates to guard everything. With Harlem, it's just a huge melange of sounds and people and space. And so when I moved to Harlem, I realized that not only did I have to be mindful of time and space in a more acute manner because I was in a new place, but also for my own safety as a Black woman. At the time in 2015, there was so much conversation about street harassment. And when I first moved here, I was being street harassed. So I had to be way more aware of the, you know, just infinite stimuli that my body was interacting with every time I stepped out the door.
Mm-hmm. And the Harlem in your novel has that feel, right,
Mm,
of real aliveness.
mm,
You were talking before about Harlem as a Black mother and all of these characters um, whose power in some ways comes out of Black motherhood, and who are under attack because of being Black mothers. I mean, that's the phrase that comes back uh, over and over in the novel, is this sort of threat that Black mothers are in. I can't quote it
mhm,
exactly, but Black
mhm,
motherhood
mhm,
is
mhm,
I forget what
mhm,
the phrase
mhm,
is, but it is that.
mhm,
And as I was reading the novel, and particularly one moment, I started to think about this other Black mother who was under real attack over the course of her life. And so the story of Henrietta Lacks came to mind.
mhm,
And the woman who is, for the audience who may not know, whose cervical cancer cells were taken without her knowledge
mhm,
and were
mhm,
later developed into the first immortalized human cell, right? Or human cell
mhm,
line. And Henrietta Lacks, whose life and death led to many breakthroughs in medical research,
mhm,
but whose family was not compensated in any way
mhm,
for it,
mhm,
I think, until recently. But I was reminded of this story when in CAUL Baby, a representative of the scientific community enters the story with the idea to profit off the regenerative cells of these Black women.
Yep. Yep.
And I wonder, as we're thinking about the archives, right, the silenced archives, the archives of Black mothers and Black people in this country, the contributions, often in Henrietta Lacks' case, unacknowledged for decades, contributions. I wonder if Henrietta Lacks was in your mind at all as you were writing, or
Yeah.
if not, what other stories, in particular?
Right. Well, so I mean, Henrietta Lacks was obviously, I mean, you're spot on. Like Henrietta Lacks was obviously inspiration. I'm thinking about the enslaved Black woman that Dr. Marion Sims experimented on without anesthesia during slavery, and he is considered the father of modern gynecology. We don't even know who those enslaved Black women are. They may have descendants right now. You know what I'm saying? So when I was thinking of the CAUL and this business, I was a little worried about it because I was like, I've never done magical realism, even though I love it in stories like with people flying in Song of Solomon or ghosts in Beloved, for example. But I was like, if this country has profited off the degradation of Black women's bodies, and even aside from slavery, this whole idea of Black women saving us, whether it's turning Georgia blue, whether it's making sure that we have a Democratic president, or whether it's just educating people, is it not that far-fetched that you would have people salivate to literally get pieces of Black women's bodies to have a longer life or to be healed? And so, yeah, I definitely drew from those medical stories.
Yeah, and it was really the entrance of that character, who was, ready, primed really to profit. That was Henrietta Lacks just came right to mind. I have two questions that I want to ask you, and then I'm going to ask anyone in the audience who has a question to please put it in the Q&A. Use the Q&A feature there for us. And the first is about the aromas of the book, because there are aromas everywhere. And then I want to get to this question about the relationship of myth and reality in magic in your story. But let me ask first about the aromas, which are just, to my mind, overwhelming and really central to what's happening here.
Okay.
So an experience of reading the book is to be overwhelmed, as I'm saying, both good and bad, with aromas. And these aromas are often, as I was reading, indicative of character, I think, or changes and transformation in the characters and their surroundings that I don't want to describe fully because I might ruin something, right? If you describe the change of smell in someone, you might
right
in the book,
right.
But I'm interested in understanding what decisions you were making around this particular sensory experience, right? Given the prominence of smells and their particularity, there's oils, there's perfumes, there's foul dairy, right? There's mildew and sourness of all kinds throughout this book. I wonder how much this was mapped out by you before you wrote,
yeah.
or whether certain smells aligned with certain ideas or characters. How did you think about smell?
Man, these are such good questions. So I knew that, like, I love sensory details. So if a lot of times when the family comes together, you'll see there's tea, there's some type of food on the table, because that's so much, I feel like, in my personal life, when it comes to Black women, I'm talking, that constitutes communion too, is the food and the beverage being passed around. Now, with regards to smell, I love smells. Like, you know what I mean? I feel like I think about, I don't know. It's funny because I'm hoping now that maybe 20, 30 years from now, I will read scholarship on this book and it's like smells pertain to characters. But it's like, I think about, if you read about how Josephine seduces Landon, who's her lover, there's certain smells in there that are considered to be aphrodisiac. What I'm thinking about, how there's a haunting in this brownstone, like Dead and Stale, for example. But I also think, you got me thinking about my own mother. One of the reasons why I love lavender as a scent, as a salve, as an oil, is because it reminds me of my mother. When I was growing up, my mother would have lavender candles. she would have all types of stuff in the bathrooms and in the bedrooms. And so, yeah, now, I mean, maybe, I mean, consciously I wasn't thinking about it, but I was like, I want there to be an aroma in the air, because so often I don't really read about smell in a book unless it's an offensive one. So I wanted there to be definitely just like this world of enchanting aromas, that actually leads into, like, I don't know, I wouldn't say bewitching, but like kind of leads to this sort of like magical family. Like that's a part of the allure too.
Yeah, right. And it isn't ever, I mean, you were describing before about your creation of these characters who on the one hand were going to be, you know, sort of villainous, and on the other hand were going to be not villainous because you love villains, and you know they were going to be round, full, realized, complicated, complex characters.
Mm-hmm.
And those, in that characterization, at least in my reading, and maybe 20 or 30 years from now, God willing, I'll write that essay because
Okay.
you know, because it's there. Like these characters are layered with their, and known by their aroma. You know, when Landon arrives to kiss Josephine, if she knows whether he's been with his wife because he does or does not taste or smell like her. And that's the sort of really like
Yeah.
fascinating, you
Yeah.
know, and it's consistent through the book. I mean, you know, you just sort of have developed these characters in that way, in the way that they both smell and
Mm-hmm.
look and sound certain ways, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the other
Mm-hmm.
thing that I was thinking about in terms of sensory stuff um, has to do with the kind of like repetitive, and I don't know whether you sort of think about this from the novel, but the ways in which there's certain sounds that get repeated um, by the house. Like the house has a character because it makes a sort of rat-tat-tat sound or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. There's a kind of
Mm-hmm.
scratching.
Yeah, because I'm trying to tell people, pay attention to this. Like this is this, and it's like it reminds me of like when you watch TV shows and there's like what they call like Easter eggs. It's like
Yeah,
I'm trying to tell you, like in the midst of all this family drama, pay attention to the subtleties in the brownstone,
right.
because it's gonna have a huge climactic finish at the end.
Mhm. And that's something that, you know, we can get from watching television, but it's also something that you learn from working with mentors and working with teachers and listening to webinars like this one, that there's a way to develop a sense of suspense and a way of understanding what's coming based on things like a sensory detail and so
Mm-hmm.
on, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you know, there's yeah. Again, I won't give away another important smell.
That's okay.
My wife is a literary agent, and she often she's thinking about her books, she'll often say that every book is a mystery. It doesn't matter what kind of book you're writing, every book is a mystery because they're trying to get you to get to the next thing, to understand the next detail, the next moment of the story. And you just
Yep.
described a non-mystery. I don't think this is a mystery. It's sort of a family drama in certain ways with mysterious elements.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it does lead you to wonder what's coming next through these kind of the details you're describing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you've talked a little bit about the line that this novel walks between myth and reality.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an idea that you refer to directly as the book comes to the close. Like that's a phrase that you use, that there's this tension here between myth and reality. But it is a feature that sort of exists throughout the book. This, you know, you sort of
Mm-hmm.
referred possibly to this play in magical realism, which
Mm-hmm.
is sort of there. Now, sometimes this interplay is part of the plot or the details. There are things that happen that seem like maybe they shouldn't be able to happen, or there's like the room is alive in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you want to talk about that, that's great. But there's one detail that I'm really interested in, and this comes from the place of narration, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a moment in the book where a mythical thing, to my mind, happens. The character who I referred to before, Iris, heals in a moment at a funeral. She just heals.
Oh yeah,
Right?
yeah,
You
yeah.
know this moment, and and I'm not giving anything away to say that Iris can heal herself or is healed just sort of
Mm-hmm.
naturally. And what happens in this moment is the narration itself, is in my reading of it at least, takes on itself a mythical quality. The writing itself sounds like a written account of an oral tradition, maybe a written account of folklore.
Ah,
And if you'll indulge me here, I'm going to quote you a little bit. If you'll indulge me.
okay, okay.
Because this doesn't sound like the rest of the narration to me. This sounds different and special. So listen, I mean, I think.
Okay,
It says,
okay.
you say, the funeral attendees left saying they saw the marks vanish with their own eyes. Others would say the lighting was bad in certain parts of the church and they couldn't see a thing. Many would not speak of what they had and had not seen. Now, when I read that, the writing seems to be beyond the story itself. Not just storytelling about what's happening, but it's as if there was a narrator beyond the narrator that we've come to know so far.
Wow.
What happened there? What made you decide that you were going to become a myth writer? I mean, it sounds like kind of biblical.
Oh,
Thanks. Like New Testament stuff.
Well, thank you. I mean, well, the thing is a part of surrendering for me, because I try to have so much control over the narrative, that I had to realize that like Black people and the Black people I grew up around, they're such great storytellers to begin with. And so for me, it was like, imagine if you saw the scene that preceded what you wrote, right? What you read. It's like, did it happen? Did it happen? Because the thing about it with these women, the Melanson family, is that they divide Harlem. There are people that don't want to believe in what they have, and other people who do believe in it, but they still think that something is off with these women. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I wanted that part of the story to leave an opening for other iterations of what happened that day that I can't say. So I tried to think about, imagine you're at a funeral where everything comes to a head emotionally, and people are dispersing into their respective homes, and they tell about what happened in the only way they know how to tell it, and it takes on other meanings and life forms. So that's why I wrote it in that way.
It sounds a little bit like that opening that you were describing, that your friends describe you as having this sort of openness to grace, that you don't need to be in control of everything, that you need to be open to the magic of storytelling itself. So Morgan and I can talk on our own for 10 or 12 more minutes if you'd like, but you're here gathered with us, so let's see if you have some questions. Yeah, here we go. So an anonymous attendee, you mentioned, Morgan, you can probably see these, but I'll read them so everyone can hear them. So you mentioned that magic was new for you, and so how did you find the magic for yourself?
Well, I will say this, like, I was inspired to write about the call because I actually have an aunt who was very perceptive when it comes to people. And my mother actually said to me, like, it's a rumor that she was born with a veil. That's number one. Number two is that, when I was doing field work for my second book, Water and Strange Lands, which was about my family's place in the Great Migration. And I did a lot of field work, and like I would say in the vein of Sorrel Neil Hurston, where I was going to different parts of the country and trying to forge dialogue between those who fled their ancestral lands versus those who remained. And when I went to the Low Country in South Carolina, and I spoke to Gullah Geechee people down there, there's this famous root doctor. His name is Dr. Buzzard. And it was a rumor. Somebody told me that it was a rumor that he was born with a call. So that's how I found the magic for myself, was looking at my family and looking at the communal traditions and the people that I've studied for a previous book.
I just put in the chat a link to the Zora Neale Hurston book of Mules and Men, which I think captures what you're describing. Yeah. There's a question in the chat about the cover and how the story itself is saying the Harlem Renaissance or Rebirth artist Romare Bearden's artwork is beautifully paired here with your novel. Can you talk with us about how this came to be?
Yeah, I didn't decide that. My art team was like, what do you think about this? This is a Romare Bearden artwork. And I wasn't that familiar with this work, I'll admit. When I looked up his work, I was like, oh, wow. He was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, and his mother was actually born in Atlantic City, New Jersey, just like my mother. So it was definitely a full circle moment that not even the art team knew. I told them, but they were the ones. My art team, I will say at Harper, they're very astute. And they were the ones that chose this cover.
Oh, great. And presumably you said, that looks great.
Yes, I love it. It was an enthusiastic praise from both myself and my agent.
Yeah, yeah, it's really beautiful. Um, so someone here is saying first, thanks for the great talk. And as we sort of get close to the time, Morgan, I'll thank you as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Maureen Boyd, one of our students in the program, is wondering about your process and how long did it take you to write Call Baby, maybe or the original story, sort of with Alexander Chi, and to think with us about the revision process, and at what point do you know when you're done?
So I wrote Call Baby as a short story. I probably wrote it over the course of a few weeks. And granted, it was 20 pages. So it wasn't like a full length novel. Now, Call Baby, I have been writing Call Baby off and on for about I will say it's been 6 years in the making, but I finished up the visions on Call Baby last year. So I'll say 5 years. Off and on for 5 years. The revision process was interesting because I knew that my publisher wanted me to be on a specific timeline for this book, and they really wanted me to get some help with revising it, with just like fleshing out more Mama's character, or figuring out the motivation for this, and figuring out how the first and the second parts of this book were going to connect. And what I did was I actually enlisted a beta reader. One of my friends, their name is Dennis Norris II, and they actually they do work at the Rumpus. They do work at Tent House, and they were the ones who helped me to like put it together. Now I was under a very strict deadline. I had to turn around revision in like a month or month and a half, and it was interesting because that was last June. And what happened last June is that with Harlem, it had this explosion of sound after this sort of post-apocalyptic silence that came with us being the epicenter of the virus. And so all of these sounds, the textures, everything came out, not only because people were socially distancing in the park, but also because of the George Floyd protests. So what I did was I leaned into that sound. My revision process was me writing no later than 7:30 in the morning and revising for maybe 3.5 hours at most. That's all I would do. I'm not a person that writes all day long. I just refuse to do it. How did I know I was done? The simple question is just my agents were like, okay, you can move on to copy edit. When you are an agent and author with a publishing house and they say that your book it can go on to copy edit, that means that not only is your book going on to production, but that also means you're going to get your check soon. So that's why I also wanted to finish.
Would you say there's a similar process with writing the nonfiction books too? That you
like, I'm done. Well, here's the thing, like with This Will Be My Doing, I will say it was the least rigorous book because it was a lot of personal essays. Yeah, I had some like secondary sources in there, but nowhere near compared to Water in Strange Lands, where like the bibliographic resources were in the hundreds, and I had to deal with audio recordings, transcriptions, fact checking, legal, all these different things. So that was that part. When it came to fiction, it was rigorous in a sense that I had to remember the world that I built. What I mean by that is like knowing that a call has magical properties. What are the properties? What are the restraints? What are the limits of that? And sticking to it. So even when my book went on to copy, the copy editors were like, hey, you just said this in 56 that contradicted or undermined what you just established on page 11. So that was something that I had to keep in mind too.
Yeah, I was answering a question for someone on the faculty today about copy editing, and I went back to something of mine that had I guess 5 years ago been copy edited, and I just saw the power of that work. Like we need copy editors so badly.
Oh yeah, because they were catching things that I would have never gotten.
Yeah. What was the of the powers that you created, of the magic that you created, what was the one in this book that you think was sort of most surprising to yourself, that just in terms of like expanding your own imagination, like, you didn't know before you started writing this book that you could, it doesn't even have to be the magic, but what did you learn from writing this book that you didn't know you could do before?
I love that I think it's just being a maximalist with language. I am a maximalist with language. I just am. And I think part of the reason why is because the first book I ever really loved was Madame Bovary. And if you read Flaubert, Flaubert is excessive in terms of prose. And I also love Lolita. As controversial as it is, I love Lolita. And Nabokov, even though he is not a native English speaker, like he's one of the few artists I feel like that really can play with the English language, like very few authors can. And I wanted to be a maximalist with this book because, again, I feel like Black women, like we owe them so much. And I wanted them to be so expansive, not only in terms of their powers, but just psychologically in this book. I also, I was just really proud of myself with writing the brownstone in the way that I did, because I actually hate writing descriptions about spaces. Like in the past, it used to be there's a table here, there's a bookshelf here. I don't like going into detail about rooms. I just don't, because I'm just not good at it. And I guess maybe it's laziness. So I was really glad that I was able to provide a sustained portrait of this brownstone in the midst of all the other things that was going on.
Well, the thing that what you were just saying about what one owes to the people who came before us and what you feel you might owe to these women and these Black women in particular, I think I was going to say that was a great place to end, but which it would have been a great place to end. But I also want to comment quickly on what you were able to do with the brownstone. To my mind, and it just gets you to have maybe a final thought before we wrap up tonight. But I didn't feel that you treated the brownstone as a static place, and maybe that's what allowed you to really go with it, because it was a place that was as much. I was thinking before about Harlem as a character and your individuals as characters. There's something about the house is possessed by character.
Yes.
And it's possessed by a monster,
It's haunted. Yeah.
So just talk for maybe just one final thought before we wrap up tonight about how you turn a static place into a haunted living place that ages with the rest of the story.
Well, I feel like for me, it's like these women temper fate. And these women have a lot of baggage, spiritual baggage of what they're doing with people and what people are doing to them. And you can't have that type of heaviness and it not be congested somewhere. So if it's not going to be congested in their bodies because they're physically impervious for the most part, it's going to be in the energy that they carry in this house. And so that's why the house was such a spiritual living place, because they're so desperate. They have imbued so much of their energy into it already. And just the people's lives that they're being involved in through the selling of their own bodies. It's almost kind of like their spiritual comeuppance in a way with this house. Where it's like, okay, well, you want to you're gonna it's almost like a thing where they say when you hold on to something so tightly it crumbles. When you let go, it's kind of like that with the brownstone. Where this house is considered to be so immaculate and is indicative of their wealth and is indicative of their legacy, but it's holding so much. It's just a reservoir for the good and the bad.
That's a perfect image to end on. The sort of crumbling in the hand is, anyone who reads the book will know what's held in the hand at the end of the book is very important indeed. Morgan, it was so great to spend this hour with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for writing this book. Thanks for joining us to talk about it. And I'm going to let people say some nice things in the chat here as we sign out. But Morgan, it was great to talk with you, and enjoy the rest of your night. And thanks for coming out.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.